What could make 18 missing minutes of a White House recording one of the most discussed details in American political history? Why did investigators, journalists, and Congress all focus so heavily on a single gap in a tape during the Watergate investigation? And how did a technical recording issue become part of a crisis that ultimately reshaped the U.S. presidency? The answer lies in the Watergate scandal, where every piece of evidence carried political weight and every unanswered question deepened public suspicion. Among all the revelations, one unexplained gap stood out, not because it proved everything, but because it existed at the center of a moment when trust and power was already collapsing. 1. The Watergate break-in. In 1972, a break-in took place at the Democratic National Committee headquarters located in the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. At first, it appeared to be a poorly executed burglary involving political operatives attempting to gather information during an election year. Early reactions from the White House dismissed the incident as minor and unrelated to higher-level political activity. However, investigative reporting quickly began to reveal inconsistencies in that narrative. Journalists and federal investigators started tracing financial links, communications, and organizational ties that suggested the individuals involved were not acting independently. As scrutiny increased, attention shifted from the break-in itself to the broader political environment surrounding it. What initially seemed like an isolated criminal act gradually expanded into a federal investigation with national implications. The Watergate scandal began to take shape, not as a single event, but as a developing pattern of political connections, secrecy, and institutional pressure. This stage marked the beginning of a growing divide between official statements and emerging investigative findings, setting the foundation for one of the most significant political crises in modern American history, where questions began to matter as much as answers. 2. The White House investigation expands. As the investigation into the Watergate break-in progressed, it began to move closer to the center of political power. What initially looked like a campaign-related burglary started to raise deeper questions about coordination and oversight within President Nixon's re-election operation. Journalists and congressional investigators uncovered financial trails and witness testimonies that suggested the involvement of individuals connected to the committee to re-elect the president. This shift changed the entire scope of the case, turning it from a criminal investigation into a political one. Inside Washington, pressure began to build rapidly. Officials were forced to respond to mounting allegations, while investigative reporting kept revealing new layers of involvement. The situation escalated further when it was discovered that conversations within the White House had been recorded on a secret taping system. This development transformed the investigation again, introducing a new and powerful form of evidence. What had started as a break-in was now evolving into a constitutional challenge, where the boundaries of political authority, transparency, and accountability were being tested in real time. The focus was no longer just on what happened outside the White House, but increasingly on what had been recorded inside it. 3. The presidential tapes. The discovery that President Nixon had installed a recording system in the Oval Office changed the direction of the Watergate investigation. These tapes were not created for public release or historical record, but as internal recordings of conversations involving the president and his closest advisors. Once investigators learned of their existence, the tapes immediately became one of the most important sources of potential evidence in the entire case. Their significance was straightforward but powerful. If released, they could confirm or challenge sworn testimony from key political figures. This placed them at the center of a legal and constitutional conflict between the executive branch and investigators seeking accountability. As subpoenas were issued, the White House refused full access, citing executive privilege. This argument set off a major legal dispute that reached beyond Watergate itself, raising broader questions about the limits of presidential power. At the same time, public attention intensified, as Americans began to realize that the investigation was no longer only about a break-in, but about recorded conversations at the highest level of government. The tapes transformed Watergate into a crisis of evidence. Trust and authority where what was recorded and what might be missing became just as important as what was said. 4. The 18-minute gap. Among the many recordings reviewed during the Watergate investigation, one tape drew exceptional attention because it contained an unexplained gap of approximately 18.5 minutes. This missing segment was identified during the process of examining White House recordings that had been requested by investigators and legal authorities. The White House later stated that the gap occurred due to an accidental erasure during routine handling of the tape. According to testimony given at the time, Rose Mary Woods, President Nixon's personal secretary, may have unintentionally activated the recording equipment while transcribing, resulting in the loss of audio. This explanation was presented publicly, but it did not fully settle the concerns raised by investigators. Subsequent technical reviews examined the physical characteristics of the tape and the nature of the missing section. However, no definitive conclusion was reached that could confirm with certainty exactly how the erasure occurred or whether it was deliberate or accidental. What made the gap politically significant was not just its existence, but its timing within an already escalating investigation. In a case where testimony and recordings were central, an unexplained missing segment naturally intensified scrutiny, adding another layer of uncertainty to an already complex constitutional and political crisis. 5. Political pressure and public trust. As news of the missing 18-minute segment spread, it entered an investigation that was already placing enormous strain on Washington's political system. By this stage, Watergate was no longer viewed as a limited scandal, but as a widening constitutional crisis involving senior members of the executive branch. The gap in the tape did not stand alone as proof of wrongdoing, but it became part of a larger pattern of questions surrounding transparency and accountability. In Congress, pressure continued to build as hearings intensified and more details from the investigation became public. Lawmakers were increasingly focused on whether critical information had been withheld or lost during a period when clarity was essential. At the same time, media coverage amplified public attention on every development, including the missing segment, which came to symbolize uncertainty in the evidence being examined. This environment created a political reality where perception carried significant weight, even without definitive conclusions about the gap itself. Its existence contributed to growing skepticism toward official explanations. Trust in institutions began to weaken as competing narratives developed between investigators, the White House, and the public. Within this broader atmosphere of suspicion, the 18-minute gap became less about a single recording and more about what it represented: the limits of transparency during one of the most closely watched political investigations in U.S. history. Supreme Court and the turning point. As the Watergate investigation intensified, the conflict between the White House and investigators reached the highest level of the U.S. legal system. The central issue was whether the president could refuse to release the tapes by citing executive privilege, or whether those recordings were subject to judicial authority in a criminal investigation. This dispute culminated in the landmark Supreme Court case United States v. Nixon in 1974. The court ruled that executive privilege is not absolute and cannot be used to withhold evidence in a criminal proceeding. This decision marked a critical turning point, as it legally required the president to comply with the subpoena and release the requested tapes. Once additional recordings were handed over, they contributed to the mounting evidence and political pressure already surrounding the administration. The release did not revolve around a single moment or single tape, but rather a broader accumulation of material that investigators and Congress were evaluating. The ruling reinforced the principle that no individual, including the president, is above the law when it comes to judicial processes. It also accelerated the constitutional crisis that Watergate had become, narrowing the political space available for the administration to continue defending its position. From this point forward, the situation moved rapidly toward its final outcome. The summer of 1974, the political situation surrounding Watergate had reached its final stage. following the Supreme Court's ruling and the continued release of taped conversations. Support for President Nixon in Congress had significantly weakened. The combination of legal pressure, political opposition, and public scrutiny created a situation where remaining in office became increasingly difficult to sustain. Rather than face almost certain impeachment by the House of Representatives and a subsequent trial in the Senate, President Nixon announced his resignation on August 8, 1974. He officially left office the following day, marking the first and only resignation of a U.S. president to date. In the aftermath, Vice President Gerald Ford assumed the presidency and later issued a pardon to Nixon for any crimes connected to the Watergate investigation. This decision itself became part of the broader national debate about accountability and justice. The Watergate scandal led to significant reforms in American political and legal systems, including changes to campaign finance regulations, government transparency standards, and oversight mechanisms. These reforms were designed to reduce the likelihood of similar abuses of power in the future. Within this broader historical outcome, the 18-minute gap remained a notable detail, an unresolved technical anomaly inside a fully documented constitutional crisis that reshaped public expectations of presidential accountability. The importance of the 18-minute gap is not that it changed the outcome of Watergate on its own. Instead, it reflects something deeper about political history. Even in well-documented events, small unresolved details can take on symbolic weight. And in moments of national crisis, and trust can become just as influential as evidence itself. That is why Watergate remains one of the most studied political scandals in U.S. history. Watergate is remembered not because of a single moment, but because of how multiple events combined into a constitutional crisis that tested the limits of presidential power. The 18-minute gap remains one of the most discussed details, not because it alone determined the outcome, but because it highlighted how even small uncertainties can take on major significance during political investigations. In the end, the scandal reshaped laws, oversight, and public expectations of government transparency in the United States. If you want clear, no-nonsense breakdowns of what's really happening in U.S. politics, make sure you subscribe.